Thanks very much, Brendan. I still hope you can hear me. So, yeah. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
we've got a mic. Here it is. It's coming around. So, if you have a question, would you please wait for the mic to get to you? Thanks. Up the back. Yeah.
Question was, the line between exhortation and coercion is certainly an important one. However, I think that the main thing that's occurred is that governments, having found that legislation has been ineffective, have finally convinced themselves that advertising will work.
Okay, there you go. Now what's happened now? Now we don't. Now we can't hear you. No. All right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Shall I speak? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I think very good. And there is an extent where governments have recognised that legislation doesn't work, certainly in the way that they would like it to. So it was just recently revealed in Ireland, for example, that the ban on public smoking hasn't actually reduced the number of smokers very dramatically. They just smoke somewhere else. And I think it's very true that governments are turning towards advertising as a way of trying to shape people's behaviour. But I think that speaks to the point I was making earlier, which is that it's not necessarily because they've become more libertarian or more open-minded or less keen to pass authoritarian laws. It's more because their view of the people has become so degenerate that they think the easiest way to change us is simply by giving us horrible images or pressurized advertising or glimpses into how we'll end up if we continue living a bad life. So in Britain, for example, there's now this new trend called toilet propaganda, where the government is basically colonizing public toilets and pub toilets with all this kind of public health information telling us about sexually transmitted diseases and smoking diseases and alcoholism and everything else. And that, I think, really speaks to the kind of degraded view that the government now takes of the public, where the only place to engage with us is basically in toilets, and the only thing to tell us is how disgusting and corroded we'll become if we carry on behaving in a certain fashion. So yes, there has been a shift from legislation towards moral blackmail, which I think is a pretty bad shift.
Okay, someone else? We don't have to come up here. I'll try and remember the question, Barry.
No speak from here.
Is it working, Elena? Okay, I come up here, Barry.
Barry Maley, Brendan. I'm just wondering whether you would agree with the idea that that when people's behaviour is becoming an ever-increasing cost to free or subsidised services, and health is a particular example, I think, that ever-increasing need to control costs leads inevitably to the impulse to control behaviour. And there's also represented there the conflict, the political conflict between a vigorous government revenue and taxation, so that controlling behaviour is becoming quite seen as essential. And there's also, I think, also the question of social costs, which aren't necessarily a burden on revenue. And I'm thinking here of environmentalism, which leads particularly to attempts to control behaviour.
Good question, Barry. Thanks. No. Just hang on a minute, Brendan. We seem to the start of the questions and the start of the answers seem to be separated by a bit. Just try now again.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. That is very true. That is one of the key arguments that's put forward by lots of modern day nanniers and nudgers, which is this idea that people's personal choices and personal behaviour has a very high cost, particularly in relation to the health service and everything else, where you kind of have to put people back together again and fix their lungs and give them gastric bands and everything else. But I think I always kind of balk slightly when government officials say, oh, your bad behaviour is costing us this many £billion and therefore we have to change the way you act. Because that's a really degraded way of understanding people's autonomy and choice and decision making. And I think in a civilized society, people should be free to make the choices they want to make and to live the lifestyles they want to live. And then it's the role of a civilized society, with the input of those people, of course, to fix them when they break down, to make them better, to allow them to go back into the world to carry on living as they see fit. You know, I read an interesting interview with a doctor in America from the 1960s, and he was asked a similar question a long time ago. Should people pay money for the fact that they sometimes make themselves ill through reckless sports or smoking or drinking? And he said, no, the whole point of being a doctor is that you don't lecture people, you don't tell them to change their life, you just make them better when they are ill so they can go back to living their life as they see fit. And I think we should really bring that outlook forward to today so that we say to governments as well as doctors, your role is not to tell people how to live, but simply to fix them if things go wrong so that they can go back to making those moral choices. Because otherwise the financial question, the question of how much our bad behavior allegedly costs, becomes another form of authoritarianism. We basically morally blackmail people to change their behavior in order to save the state money.
Okay, now I think the wireless mic apparently is working. So
Brendan, it's Alana. Can you hear me?
Vaguely.
That's a yes.
I can hear that.
Good.
Okay. Anyone? Okay. Down the front here. Yep. I think we can. I think you can use this now. Yep. But put it close to your mouth. Yep.
Yeah, my name's Philip Brown. Is there any evidence that nudging works? I mean, as far as I think, it didn't work for Stalin, the authoritarians of the left, nor did it work for Hitler, the authoritarian for the right, because it soon dissipated. It hasn't worked in this diet, trying to convince us to eat diets. We're getting fatter and fatter. Is it just some fad which is going to disappear without any effect in 10 years' time?
The example that people always give, the example that Sunstein and Thaler give in their book, is that there was this experiment in Europe, I think it was in Germany, where in government buildings they put a kind of fake fly on urinals, this kind of pretend blue bottle fly on urinals, to try and make men aim better when they go to the toilet. And they found, it's a very bizarre, crude example, but they found when they put this fake fly on a urinal, there tended to be less spillage because men were aiming at this kind of fake target. And that is always cited as the really good example that nudging works. That if you just make a subtle shift in the physical infrastructure, can really radically change the way people behave. But I think that indicates just how ridiculous the whole idea is, the fact that that is the one idea that's talked up the most. So there isn't any great evidence that it works in terms of changing people's behavior. But where I think it does work is in making people feel guilty about their behavior. So I was in New York recently, and New York is basically the world's #1 nudgeocracy. They're obsessed with nudging. And they've done this thing of bringing in calorie count in all restaurants. So every restaurant you go into New York, whatever you order, it will say 1,500 calories, 800 calories, 700. Well, I was just actually coming to the end of the answer, which is that the way in which nudging is successful is that it induces a kind of Catholic feeling of guilt in people. So they might not necessarily change how they behave, but they certainly feel very guilty about it, whether it's about eating the wrong foods or smoking or failing to recycle. So it does have a detrimental impact in the sense that it makes people feel bad, but it doesn't necessarily make people change their behavior. So it still has this regressive impact on people's lives.
Right. Okay, Paul, over there.
Hi, Brendan. Paul Fletcher. When I read the book, I got a slightly different impression of what they were talking about. I was struck by the examples about retirement planning, particularly in the US system, and the fact that people will do irrational things like not even ticking a box to get their employer to co-contribute under the US system. And I took away from it that one of the key ideas was that it's important to think about how you set up defaults so that where there's a choice, if you set up the default in a way that best serves the interests of the citizen, then that's a better outcome than not thinking about how you set the defaults at all.
Yes, that's one of the advantages. They particularly make it issues like organs. Yeah. They basically said, in order to get more people to donate organs, you should make it a kind of default option and make it easier and kind of nudge people towards the right kind of behavior. But even there, even though that sounds like a very kind of mundane, acceptable thing that not many people would get angry about, it still is based on the idea that it's better to simply make people default rather than to rationally engage with them. It's still built on this tendency to circumvent rational, open, public discussion in favor of just making everything super, super easy by not having people tick a box and instead just leaving it as it is, leaving it open. So it still has that problematic starting point, which is the notion that it's to kind of get around people's irrationalities by making everything nudgeable and easy, which I think is a problematic starting point. I'm sure on lots of these fairly mundane questions, if you actually rationally engaged with people and had a proper public discussion about it, they would change the way in which they behave. It's the underhand method that I don't like.
Okay, next question. Anyone? Yeah? No, up the back here? Yeah.
What about the argument that historically nudging had taken place in any case, and that therefore this sort of nudging sort of policies are about redressing implicit historical problems? For instance, in transportation economics, for many years it's been known that there is a subsidy towards cars of about $3 compared with rail of about $1 from the public sector. Therefore, historically, the subsidies were already towards one mode of transportation, and that therefore if you're changing the relative prices of forms of transport using nudging theories, you're just redressing something that already existed.
I only caught tiny bits of that question. If someone could just summarise it. I didn't hear the whole thing.
I'm going to have another go because I thought he was hearing it, so I didn't actually jot anything down. Try again.
Historically, in relative price structures in society, often they've never been spelt out as to precisely what the existing relative price structures are and existing public subsidy levels. So, for instance, in transportation economics, it's been known since about 40 years that cars are subsidised to about $3 versus, say, rail at about $1. And various modes of transport have different levels of price subsidies. So if these implicit subsidies historically existed, and the sort of modern nudging theories seem to be about making this, changing what's already implicit towards another set of implicit subsidies. In other words, your world seems to be one where there's this bad thing coming, whereas you could argue there was always a bunch of nudging theories in place which were not explicitly recognised.
The way I would see it, there have always been price structures. There have always, the question of money and price has always been to behaviour a certain fashion. So we make some forms of transport, people will get on a bus rather than drive a car and whatever else. But I think the key question is whether there is a moralistic component or not. If it's a simple price structure because you want more people to use the bus, I don't really have a big problem with that. I'm not going to go to the barricades fighting for the right to have equal pricing on all forms of public transport. But if pricing is introduced in order to enforce a moralistic message, that's when I think it becomes problematic. So John Stuart Mill, in relation to alcohol, he refers to this as a sin tax. So he said when they raise the price of alcohol, they're basically punishing you for your sin. They're making you pay a kind of penance for the fact that you like to drink alcohol. So he refers to it as a sin tax. And we are seeing the introduction of sin taxes across the modern world these days, where governments are kind of raising the price. In Britain, we're raising the price of cheap alcohol because the government really hates the idea of poor people getting drunk and having a wild time. That is very clearly a moralistic price structure, which is designed to firstly punish people for their behaviour, and secondly try to get them to change their behaviour so it becomes more conformist. So you're absolutely right. There have always been price structures which have a kind of behaviour modification in mind, but some of them have been pretty inoffensive. It's the kind of moralistic ones that I find pretty offensive today.
Yes, well, they're trying to talk about taxing cheap wine here too, for much the same sort of reason. So it's infected all the world. Any other question there? Yeah, over here, Paul again. Here it comes. Yep.
Brennan, just to come back to the question of the impact on the public purse of...
I can't hear very well.
Put it close to your mouth, perhaps.
Just to come back to the question of the cost of the health system, do you argue that it's inappropriate to engage in any kind of behavioural encouragement which is designed to reduce the cost of the health system and in turn, therefore, the burden on taxpayers generally of the health system?
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear that question. I think if people hold the microphone closer to their mouth, I can hear it better.
Let me try one more time. Can you hear that? My question is about the cost of the health system and the fact that the health system is essentially paid for by taxpayers and the cost is ever expanding. Therefore, to my mind, policies which are designed to reduce public health expenditures are pretty attractive. The consequence of not doing that in practical terms is that the tax burden on individuals is going to go up. So I'm just interested in your response to that perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a real problem with public health these days, and there's too much of it. I think there's too much obsession with public health rather than just leaving people to sort out, rather than just treating it as a private health issue and treating the health of individuals. And the danger with public health is that when you're talking about the health of a population or the health of an entire nation, you inevitably speak in sweeping generalizations and you inevitably become quite authoritarian because it's about improving the health of everyone. So there is a real kind of philosophical problem when you go from treating the health of individuals, we all have various individual ailments, towards treating the health. And sometimes it can tip over into becoming this fairly tyrannical idea that everyone must have a certain standard of behavior in order to keep the public health at a certain level. And I just find that, I think in a civilized society it is right that taxpayers contribute to a health system which looks after everybody. I think that is a pretty decent idea. Not to say that I'm a fan of the National Health Service here in Britain, which is a complete and utter disaster and is transformed precisely into this kind of nudging authoritarian bully boy where they're more interested in telling us how to live rather than just fixing us when we're ill. But the general principle that society should look after sick people is a good one. But I think it should veer away from turning that into a financial question or using financial blackmail or talking about reducing costs as a way of changing people's behavior or nudging people. And just go back to the idea, the old going back to the Greek times, which was that the role of a doctor was to fix physical ailments and to leave moral questions to the individual and to society.
Okay, Luke.
G'day, Brendan. Luke Malpass here. Hey, just a comment and a question. Firstly, it's quite interesting, the kind of war on cheap booze. In the UK, the report that was used to try to kind of bring an intellectual basis for the, or an economic basis, I should say, for the minimum price was actually totally misread by the Chief Medical Officer of Britain, who at the time was a fellow called Liam Donaldson, I think. And he ended up saying, well, there's all this evidence that supports a minimum price and heavy drinkers will drink a lot less, so this will be a good thing. When in actual fact, the report didn't really say that at all. So they're more sensitive to price, but overall it won't actually change drinking habits at all, except for moderate drinkers. So I've always found that interesting because down here, that's of course what all the kind of public health advocates go and quote, say, oh, the Chief Medical Officer of Britain said this, but of course it was he was totally misquoted the misunderstood, I should say, the report. So everything that minimum pricing for cheap grog in Britain is based on is not actually in the evidence. The question I just had was where did you read the quote from the doctor in the 60s?
Where did I get the quote from the 60s? I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can email it to you. I quoted it in an article I wrote about 2 weeks ago. It was an interview with an American microbiologist who was asked the question of basically what is the role of a modern doctor, and he made the point that the role of a modern doctor is to fix people rather than to change people, basically. In relation to minimum pricing, I think that's the question of whether it works and what impact it has and what population it impacts on. I think those are all really important questions. The way I see it, the way Mill saw it, and the way I see it also is that it's a form of prohibition, because if you are attempting to price certain people out of the market, then your instincts are prohibition instincts. You might not be introducing prohibition for the whole of society, but you're introducing it for a certain section of society. But it's true that it doesn't have an instant, immediate impact, particularly on less well-off drinkers. Booze in Britain is pretty cheap now. You can get a can of lager for 99p. You don't have to be very rich to get smashed out of your head. But the thing is that it does have that impact of giving rise to this social view of poor drinkers as basically irresponsible scumbags. It creates a very clear distinction between poor drinkers, who are seen as irresponsible. They're always referred to as binge drinkers. They're always referred to as these kind of irresponsible individuals, whereas middle-class drinkers who stay at home and have expensive wine, they're seen as good and responsible and decent people. So it's a syntax, and it's driven by prohibitive instinct that gives rise to this quite snobbish distinction between good and bad drinkers, which I think is pretty problematic.
Okay, any more there? Right. Well, given the sort of technical issues we had, I think we did sort of reasonably well. Brendan, thanks very much for getting up nice and early for doing this. When we sort of first set the seminar, the talk up, of course, we didn't have daylight saving, and so it meant Brendan had to get up a little bit earlier. I'll be fortunate enough to be in London next week for the Battle of Ideas conference, which I guess you're speaking at, Brendan. So I look forward to catching up with you then. And thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and thank Brendan in the usual way.